All right, my friends, today we're going to talk about the visual art elements and then we will also go over principles in this video. So you may have heard of these before, hopefully in an art class, if you've taken an art class. The elements of art in your book, they are a little bit different. So I'm going to go over just the important things that you need to know for this class. So we have the formal elements of design. In your textbook, they call them the visual elements: line, shape, mass, space, time and motion, light, color, and texture. So I wanted to stop there. And in your art classes in the past, you may have, instead of the word mass, you may have heard the word form. And then instead of light, you may have heard the term value. Okay, so the first one is line. Our basic means for recording and symbolizing ideas, observations, and feelings. It is a primary means of visual communication. Obviously, we know that lines can be straight or curved or long or short, dashed or zigzag. And all of these different types of lines can convey different feelings in an artwork. We also want to talk a little bit about implied line, and those are things that are going to suggest visual connections. So we can see this circle here is sort of connecting these two faces, and then this line from the nose here meets with this line from the nose here. Then we move on to shape. A shape is within a two-dimensional area, and a mass would be three-dimensional. So what you have heard before called form. Volume would be when mass encloses space. So think about like a sculpture carved out of marble or something that would have volume. Okay. We also want to point out that shapes can be either geometric or organic. A geometric shape are things, think about math, they're precise, they're regular. And then organic shapes would be like this O'Keeffe painting, irregular, sometimes they curve, they're rounded, very informal and relaxed. Another thing that we need to talk about when we are discussing shape is positive space and negative space. So for example, in this image, the tree would be the positive space. It's the where the shape is taking up space in your artwork, and negative would be everything surrounding it. Okay, so we talked already a little bit about mass. There are a couple of things that I want to bring up when we are talking about size, and that is the difference between scale and proportion. So scale is the size or apparent size of an object in relation to other objects, people, or its environment. So the example of this would be this Oldenburg, Claes Oldenburg sculpture called Spoon Bridge in Cherry. But with proportion, you're really looking at the relationship of parts to a whole and to one another. So think about when you're drawing either the human figure or even a human face. You know, you have certain proportions that you know where to place the nose, the mouth, the ears in a drawing of a human face because most faces have a similar proportion. Okay, we're moving on to space. So this is another element. And there are several ways that you can imply depth or space in a two-dimensional artwork. And these are the main three right here. Number one, you can have something overlap something else. So obviously, if part of a figure, like let's look at this person here in the front, is covering up something else, you know that this figure is closer to you than this figure because it is overlapping. Okay, the second one is diminishing size. So you also know that if something is larger, it's probably closer to you. So if you look at these figures, and this head is this size, but this person's head is tiny, you know that this person is probably closer to you than this person, and it's creating that illusion of depth and space within a painting. And then the last one, and one that people don't think about often, is vertical placement. So the higher up, the closer toward the top of a painting, the further back something is. So again, the people that are closest to us are further down here. The people that are farther away are further up on the canvas. Okay. The other thing that we need to talk about with space is this idea of linear versus atmospheric perspective. So with linear perspective, it's all going towards 1 point or 2 points, depending on how you're looking at something. You have a vanishing point, a horizon line. And an example of that would be this Raphael painting, School of Athens. Here are the lines that correlate with that. The other type of perspective that you could use is called atmospheric perspective. So obviously we don't have a building here. It's a lot harder to create a vanishing point when we have all these mountains in the background. But what they've done is as these hills and mountains get further back, they become much lighter, and that is called atmospheric perspective. So the things that are closer to us are more vivid, and the things that are further away are sort of washed out by the atmosphere. I'm sure that most of you have heard this concept of value. It just means the lightness or darkness of a color or hue. And then we are moving on to color. So I'm going to flip in my book for a minute. Okay, so instead of saying color, you might hear the word hue. These two words are interchangeable. So hue just means the name of a color. Value, we just talked about, it's the lightness or darkness of a color. Tint, you get a tint when you add white to a hue. So for example, pink would be a tint of red, because if you add white to red, you get pink. A shade is when you add black to a hue. So an example of a shade would be like navy blue, because you would add black to blue to get navy blue. And then intensity or saturation is how pure the hue is. We have our color wheel here. A few things that you need to make sure you know are primary, secondary, and intermediate or tertiary colors. So primary are red, yellow, and blue. Secondary, we have orange, green, and purple. And then the intermediate colors are the ones that have these sort of combo names: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, green, etc. And one thing I do want to point out with that is when you're naming these intermediate or tertiary colors, you'll always put the primary color first. So it'll always be red, orange. You would never say orange, red. You'll always put the primary color first. And those are mixtures of a primary and a secondary. So we have some color schemes that we need to look at. Monochromatic is variations of the value and intensity of just one hue. So it's only one color. And here's our example here. Analogous, these are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So an example of that would be Van Gogh's The Night Cafe. It kind of gives you this peaceful feeling. And then complementary are colors across from each other on the color wheel. And one thing I want to point out with complementary are when you put these complementary colors together in a work, it can be very jarring. It can almost create like a vibration when you're looking at it. And so that's not always the most peaceful feeling. Okay, and then the last element is texture. You can have either actual texture, like this Oppenheim object, breakfast in fur, or you can have implied texture. So if you'll remember from one of our previous um, lectures, the Arnolfini portrait, this is a painting. It's two-dimensional, but when you look at it, there are textures that are implied. You know, I feel like if I was able to touch that mirror, it would be very smooth, or these beads that are hanging here. They look very smooth and shiny. All right, so that is the elements, visual art elements. And now we are going to move on to principles. Like I said, I'm just going to put these both in the same video. Okay, principles of design. We have unity and variety. We have balance, emphasis and subordination, directional forces, contrast, repetition and rhythm, scale and proportion. So unity and variety. Unity, all the elements are working, they belong together and make up a coherent and harmonious whole. And the variety provides diversity. So this Jacob Lawrence gouache painting is a perfect example of one that has both. So all of these elements are working together. You can even see some repetition in there that we'll get to later. But then every once in a while we have some variety, something different. It's not boring. The variety is what's going to make an artwork more interesting. Then the next principle of design is balance. So we have a few different types here, symmetrical, asymmetrical, and we want to talk about weight in an artwork. So if we look at this rose window, we can tell that it has a symmetrical balance. It's also a radial balance because it's all balanced around a center point of a circle. Okay, the next one we want to talk about is emphasis and subordination. So emphasis is something that draws our attention. Subordination would be things that we want to push to the background. So if we look at the still life with lobster, they're definitely wanting us to look at this bright red lobster. And then artists will use neutral areas of lesser interest to keep us focused on the things that they want us to focus on. The directional forces used in a drawing or painting or a work of art are important because these are ways that the artist can control the paths that our eye will follow. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is contrast. The contrast is going to create drama and juxtaposition. This is a really interesting image from your online notes. You can see that these are plastic bottles, and then they're contrasting with these natural fibers here. Okay, repetition and rhythm. We have things like pattern. An example would be this Bridget Riley, movement in squares. And then also repetition. So even though these are not the exact same shape repeated, it creates this sort of calmness by the repetition of these bars of soap. If you haven't ever heard of this photographer, Tom Keither, he photographs objects that are taken from immigrants when they cross the border. So that's very interesting and thought-provoking work. So then we talk about rhythm again. This ladder for Booker T. Washington by Martin Puryear is in the Modern here in Fort Worth. And I would urge you to watch this video about the work. We've already talked about scale and proportion in our last slideshow, so I'm going to skip that one.